This is our class on Indigenous America. This lesson is going to provide you with a very broad overview of the early history of Indigenous people in North America. Now, when we talk about Indigenous people, the group of people we're referring to are uh, the people who lived in North America before the arrival of people from Africa and Europe, and then eventually from other parts of the world. Now, I use the term indigenous, which refers to the fact that they were sort of the original inhabitants of this continent before uh, the arrival of others. Um, but it's important to note that there are other terms that have been used to describe this group of people. And some of these terms I'm sure you've all heard about. Native Americans is very common. American Indians used to be very common. I think even maybe 40 or 50 years ago, that was still a term that many people used without even giving it a second thought. Um, in other places, you might see the term Aboriginal, like in New Zealand or even in Australia. In Canada, the Indigenous peoples are often referred to as the First Nations. Um, and here in the US, uh, you do see uh, different terms used to describe this group. You see Indigenous quite a bit. You still see Native American quite a bit. And there are Indigenous groups who use the word Indian to describe themselves. Not all, but certainly some. So that's the group of people that we're talking about. Now, when we talk about the fact that they were here before Europeans, Africans, and people from other places who came later, it's important to note that uh, they were here before those other groups showed up, but their beliefs about their own place in North America differs based on group. So some indigenous peoples believe that their group uh, was always here, right, since the beginning of time, that they've always been here. Uh, Others, have different views that might be a little more constrained in terms of time period. Um, Almost all of the different indigenous groups have different creation stories uh, that are part of their spiritual beliefs and also part of their culture that help situate them in the world, help explain how and why their group came into existence. So, really, no matter what uh, each group believes, each of them does have a set of beliefs about their place in North America, whether they believe they've always been here, whether they believe that they've only been here a relatively short time, and whatever they believe about how their group came into being, each of them does have a set of beliefs and ideas that help root their group in this continent. Now, despite what indigenous groups may or may not believe about their place in North America, how long they've been here, etc., um, it's been pretty definitively proven that indigenous peoples uh, have been in North America for roughly the first arrivals, roughly 35,000 years ago, and the last roughly 13 to 15,000 years ago. So you can see I've sort of jumped over a point here for a second. So again, we say, okay, the first indigenous peoples who call North America home arrived in North America 35,000 years ago. Okay, the last group made its way here about 20,000 years later. Okay, well, first of all, where did they come from? When we look at the next slide, we'll see that the best evidence we have tells us that most indigenous peoples came from uh, East Asia, right? Came from what is now Russia, Eastern Siberia, and that they walked across what was then solid ground, what is today open water separating Alaska and Eastern Russia. They made this walk from one continent to another, uh, and then dispersed down into Alaska, what is now Canada, the US, Central and South America, right? So that's again a very broad explanation for a very complicated historical process. Now, the other question to answer right here is, well, how do we know that these people came from Siberia, right? Well, first, I guess the best answer for that is that um, we have the benefit of DNA testing, right? And it's only really been definitively proven in the past decade or so that the indigenous people of North America have Siberian roots. I mean, this theory about there being a land bridge between Russia and Alaska, that theory's been around a long time, but it was really only proven in the past decade, when professional scientists who work in archaeology um, tested and compared the DNA from the remains of indigenous peoples, very old indigenous peoples, thousands of years old, that were found in Siberia, and compared those to the DNA of similar remains found in North America, and found that there was an almost perfect match between them. So that's sort of how we know, right? Thank you, DNA testing, for helping us with that. Now, the other question then is, how do we know how long ago um, indigenous peoples from Siberia made these journeys? And again, that's not, I guess part of that can be determined, again, from archaeology. Uh, Carbon dating, radiocarbon dating, which is a technology that's been around for about 55 years, um, can tell us a lot about objects and human remains that are discovered in archaeological digs. So, by using a relatively modern technology that is used to determine the age of an object, archaeologists and other scientists who work in this field have been able to determine the length of time um, over which people from Siberia made this journey from Asia to America. Now, okay, so we've established where they came from. We've established how long ago they made these journeys. We've established their ethnic background, right, which is Asian, right, but which I should mention is roughly half East Asian and half European, um, for most indigenous peoples. Um, but then the big question is why? Why would these people walk from one continent to another without the assistance of horses or sleds or any real modern transportation technology, without really very warm clothing or solid boots or heavy socks to keep their feet warm? Why would they make this trip? Right? It's certainly not the kind of trip any of us would want to take, and it's important to keep that in mind. So, why would they make this trip? So, the first point to remember is they didn't make the trip thinking that they were leaving Asia and going to America, right? So, that's the first point. This was not an intentional departure from Asia to North America, right? People's worldview 35,000 years ago didn't involve thinking about the world in terms of continents and oceans or even nation states, which didn't exist. Um, People's worldview was generally confined to the few square miles around wherever their home was. So the fact that people from Asia made it to North America um, wasn't a complete accident, but it's important that we remember they didn't make this trip thinking to themselves, well, we're leaving Asia today and we're not coming back, right? The reason they make the trip is because they're following their food source, which is primarily uh, animals, right? So these are hunters. And of course, living in an Arctic environment, that's really the only type of subsistence that they could hope for. So they're following their food source. And animals don't really know that they're leaving Asia and going to America. And hunters living in an Arctic environment simply followed those herds of animals wherever they went. And it just so happened that uh, those herds took those hunters from one part of the world to another. And that also helps explain why they didn't all leave at the same time, right? It's not like every Siberian woke up one morning and decided, well, we're out of here. We're not coming back. We're tired of this place. Um, we're going to find a better life in North America. They had no concept of North America, right? Again, there's no concept of these places being separate entities. They're just following their food source. So the fact that this migration from Asia to America happens for almost 20,000 years tells us that it's a relatively small group of people who are making this trip, right? Um, a handful, really, who actually make the trip from Asia to America. And then that small group, sort of seed uh, the populations that grow over time. So it's again, it's a relatively limited migration that has over time pretty large consequences for the population of North America. Now, you might also be thinking to yourself, well, how could people survive under these kinds of conditions, right? It's the Arctic. I suppose if they were up there today, it might be easier with global warming, but you know, 15,000 years ago, 35,000 years ago, um, it's much colder and uh, it's a harsh environment. And these people did not have all of the conveniences that we have today to keep themselves warm and to survive. So, one of the, I guess, theories that I think is pretty well founded regarding the health of indigenous people is that yes, they certainly um, lived in a difficult environment. They did not live easy lives. Their survival depended almost completely on hunting and finding available food sources whenever and wherever they could. But they were also active all the time, right? So their bodies were constantly sort of being used and being built up. Um, and the food they took in, a lot of protein, helped with muscle development and helped their health uh, to be maintained. But also, that cold Arctic climate that they lived in helped kill off any potential diseases um, that they might have otherwise fallen ill with. So, viruses and bacterial infections that would later be brought by Europeans and to a certain extent by people from Africa, um, those were unknown um, in eastern Siberia, Alaska, and even in North America once indigenous populations started to grow. And this is sort of a built-in um, uh, problem for them because they're not exposed to these diseases. It's too cold for these diseases to really survive. So when they're living in North America, um, they're fine as long as they're all living there together, all indigenous people. But once people from other parts of the world who have been exposed to these viruses, for example, like the flu or smallpox, um, or yellow fever, right? Um, Typhus. People from other parts of the world arrive. Indigenous peoples will have no immunity to those diseases, and that's the topic we're going to come back to later on. So just put that uh, feather in your cap for now. So a blessing at first, right? An Arctic climate. It's cold. The climate is really harsh. It helps kill off potentially deadly diseases, but that uh, lack of immunity will only uh, really, I guess, stick around as long as people who have been exposed to those diseases or who carry them don't arrive. And of course, we know that eventually does happen. Okay, so that's sort of just a big overview of indigenous peoples, where they're from, how they got over here, what they did, who they were, why they came, right? Some of their beliefs. Again, we don't know much about how many indigenous people were living in North America at the time that the first Africans and Europeans began arriving, right? So Columbus arrived in North America in 1492 in the Caribbean. So if we can use the year 1500 roughly as sort of the year when European and later African peoples began arriving in large numbers in North America, we can say that roughly between 1 and 18 million people, indigenous people, were living in North America. Now, do we have any records of that? No, right? I mean, the only records that we really would have would be um, human remains, which would have to be counted and carbon dated to determine their age, which would just be a monumental task, which would probably never happen, right? So this figure be somewhere in a range between 1 and 18 million. This is a figure that we really don't know. Um, Somewhere in there, indigenous people did not keep population records. They didn't keep documents, right? Paper records. They didn't keep birth certificates, death certificates, records of funerals. Um, Indigenous peoples relied on what we call an oral tradition or oral history, uh, where family histories, clan histories were passed down from generation to generation by storytelling, right? So you guys all probably have family members and you know some of your family history from older family members who've told you stories, right? That's the indigenous tradition. So we really don't know how many indigenous people were here. Scholars who have studied this have come up with this range. It's a really large range, right? There's a huge difference between 1 and 18 million, but that's the best that we can really come up with for all of North America, right? So we're going from Alaska down through um, to South America. Now, how did indigenous people survive? Right now, this will change over time. As I mentioned before, most of them are hunting, and we'll look at these slides in a moment. Um, Hunting usually large game like deer, elk, bison, bear, a variety of large animals that they could use for both fur and meat and for other purposes. Many indigenous peoples, especially once they moved into areas of North America that had four seasons, would also gather uh, wild plants, uh, nuts and berries, uh, wild root vegetables, mushrooms, right? Uh, and again, it's important for us to remember, we go to the grocery store, buy our food, we pray to God it's not going to poison us when we get home. Indigenous peoples, especially ones moving into areas of North America that had not been inhabited in the past, a lot of this is trial and error. You might see a mushroom sticking out of the ground and you might think, oh, okay, well, that looks good. Give it a try, and then die, right? And then the other members of the group will learn, okay, well, we won't eat that mushroom again. Um, and then, you might try another uh, wild plant or wild berry, and again, see what the effects are on the human body before deciding whether um, it's safe to eat or consume. So when we talk about what indigenous peoples did, right, in order to survive, it's important to remember, yes, they hunted. We could stop and just say, well, they hunted, big deal. Well, they had to know which parts of the animal's body were safe to eat and which were not. And the only way to figure that out was to have someone try, right? The same went with gathering uh, the different wild plants and berries and nuts and vegetables that they could find. Also with fish, I mean, there are some fish that uh, if you eat them raw or if they're undercooked, you could have some serious health issues, allergies, food poisoning, etc. So um, a lot of the subsistence involved testing to see what was consumable and what was not, and farming. Right. Again, you might see this on the list and think, oh, okay, well, farming, they've got a field filled with corn and they plant it in the spring and it comes up in August and they harvest it and that's it. Well, again, plants had to be domesticated, meaning wild plants um, had to be domesticated, had to be taken by human beings out of their wild state and replanted in sort of these confined environments, farms, and grown on purpose, right? A wild fruit tree isn't growing on purpose. No one planted it. But when you domesticate a wild plant or a wild animal for that matter, you're taking it from its wild state and turning it into something that's reliant on the sun, but also reliant on human beings. And not all wild plants or wild animals, for that matter, uh, are amenable to being domesticated. So, a lot of what we talk about in history, sometimes I think people have some professors and teachers have a tendency to just glide over things and they'll just say, oh, well, they hunted, they gathered, they fished, and they farmed. Well, yeah, they did those things. But again, our job, especially in a college classroom, is to dig below the surface, right? And think about what actually is involved in these activities. And it's more than just shooting an arrow at a bear and hoping you hit it and kill it. It's more than going and picking a mushroom up off the ground or spearing a fish in a river or growing some corn. These are really complicated processes that sometimes involve people dying and sometimes involve people getting very sick, but that over time allowed indigenous peoples' populations to grow on this continent. Now, as I said before, this image shows us roughly what I just described in the last slide, where I really got carried away. So you see Siberia there on the top left-hand corner. You see the rough direction that indigenous people took on their journey from Siberia into North America, and then the dispersal into the rest of the hemisphere. And as I said before, that type of a journey would not be possible today because if you look up at the top center part of that map, you'll see that area between Alaska and Siberia at that time was uh, dry land, and of course today it is water. So one would have to swim across to make the trip. Now, this slide shows us uh, both, well, it shows us a couple different things that are worth pointing out. The first is that it shows us the diversity of indigenous groups living in North America. And I'm not sure how much indigenous history that you guys have studied either in high school or in other uh, classes you've taken in college or films you've watched or television shows that you've watched, but I think there's a tendency sometimes, especially among people who are not indigenous, to again paint all indigenous people with the same brush, assume that they sort of all held the same beliefs, practiced the same kind of subsistence activities, uh, had the same sort of marital customs and uh, politics and economy. And of course, none of that is true. I mean, you'll obviously find similarities among some groups, but depending on where they lived and how long they had been in North America and the types of traditions that they developed, and also the languages they spoke, even though they're all indigenous, they're all sort of living life according to their own ideas and customs and traditions and beliefs. Now, so that's one point just to make about this map. The other point, of course, is regarding the economic activity, which is the purpose of the slide. So you'll see that most of the slide, most of the map of North America is green. And I'll come back to this in a minute, but there's a reason for that, right? For the fact that the vast majority of people are doing hunting as their primary subsistence activity. Uh, the purple, of course, agriculture, the red, hunting and gathering, which also, by the way, doesn't mean they weren't farming, and fishing primarily along the Alaskan coast and Pacific Northwest and the coast of California. Now, important to remember, maps like these are hard to make because inevitably you have to draw divisions somewhere. Uh, you should note that there are, even though there are divisions between purple, red, blue, and green, there's a lot of overlap that we don't see here. So, if you see a lot of green, that doesn't mean those people didn't also fish, didn't also hunt and gather, and didn't also farm, right? So that's a point I want you to remember. This map is nice, but it can be misleading. So now we're going to talk about indigenous peoples once they're in North America, once they sort of settled down a bit, what types of activities they engaged in, and then sort of how those activities changed in time. As I just mentioned, most indigenous peoples hunted. That was the primary means by which they survived, not just in terms of food, but also in terms of the other resources that they acquired from hunting. So that's the first point I want to make right there. Most indigenous peoples, I'd say that the vast majority, did some hunting. Now, in terms of asking ourselves why they did so much hunting, historical context is important. This was what most people in Siberia did to survive, right? So it makes sense that those modes of subsistence would be passed down from generation to generation, right? These the jobs that people did, the ways that people survived, were intergenerational. So it makes sense that indigenous peoples would continue doing what they had always done. Connected to that is the fact that they lived in an environment that was cold, that was pretty harsh in terms of the long winters, and where other activities like gathering and farming and even fishing were sometimes impossible to do. So, if the environment you lived in only allowed for hunting, then that was the only way you could survive, then you hunted, right? I mean, that made sense. So, just because these people left Asia and ended up in America, again, they didn't know that they had left Asia and ended up in America. So their ancestors continued doing the same activities that they had done. And they continued hunting, even when they were living in places that had other resources available. Now, as I mentioned before, uh, the dominant species that indigenous peoples hunted were typically large animals, the ones that they could get the most resources from. So, woolly mammoth, for example, an animal that is now extinct, but that used to be commonly found across North America. And in fact, uh, homeowners and farmers sometimes find woolly mammoth skeletons intact in their on their properties in the U.S. There used to be large wild horse populations in North America, which are also, I think, completely gone. There are wild horse populations in America today, but those horses are the descendants of horses mainly brought over by the Spanish. Excuse me, I need a drink of water. Um, there were wild lions, so, big cats in North America, also extinct. Too bad. And one of the large animals that has survived, almost was destroyed, but uh, has survived up to the present, the American bison, also known as the buffalo, right? The This animal pictured here in a painting by the famous American painter George Catlin in the mid 19th century. Uh, the American bison has been the national mammal of the United States, I think, since 2015. Um, it used to be found on the back, the reverse side of the nickel. I think it might have even been put back on there. Check your coin collection. And the bison, uh, at its peak around 1800, numbers vary, but there were somewhere between 50 and 80 million bison in North America around the year 1800. And within 90 years, that population had been diminished down to less than 700 through overhunting, um, mainly by white Americans. Now, the American bison could be found all across North America if you go way back. By the early 19th century, it was mainly confined to the middle section of the US. Um, and it was a really important resource for the indigenous people who lived there. Of course, these animals are really large and they could provide a lot of meat for large groups of people for long periods of time. The skins could be taken off and turned into dwellings, turned into tents, um, or even into clothing that they could wear. Uh, and the other body parts of the bison would be used for a variety of different purposes. There was almost no waste among indigenous peoples. They would find a way to use almost every part of the animal's body. So, in terms of hunting, that sort of, again, provides a broad overview of the types of animals that were popular for hunters. The largest ones, the better, right? Because they would provide the most benefit. But around 10,000 years ago, there was a period of climate change that was, again, global in scale, um, that affected the world in roughly the same way that the periods of climate change that have happened since have affected the world, right? Sometimes climate change can involve periods of hotter temperatures, sometimes cooler temperatures. Um, Sometimes you might have periods of extreme rainfall and snowfall, and then you might have periods of extreme drought, right? But whatever the shift is, whether it's higher or lower temperatures, more or less precipitation, periods of climate change occur over long periods of time, first of all. So you can't say that one hot summer is climate change or one cold winter is climate change. Just like you can't say one cold winter is climate change or disproves climate change, or that a cool summer disproves global warming, right? You look for patterns, and patterns can only be established by looking at long periods of time. And so we do know pretty conclusively, climate scientists have proven that there was a period of climate change roughly 10,000 years ago, again, where temperature patterns and precipitation patterns deviated from what was expected and from what had been common in the past, right? And that those changes continued over a long period of time. And so, what were the results of climate change, um, for uh, for both animals and people living here on Earth? Well, climate change almost always leads to habitat decline, right? Um, it almost always makes it more difficult for people living in a place to continue living there, right? So if you have extreme drought and your crops don't grow, that also likely means the animals you hunt are not going to be available because they won't have food. The fish that you have, that you used to uh, go and catch in the lake or the river, probably won't be available because if there's drought, there's probably no water, and the water might have dried out, or the river, the lake might have dried up. Um, and uh, So for humans and for animals, when your habitat declines, whether it's through drought, whether it's through extreme flooding, fire, um, combination of all of those, possibly, uh, extreme cold, extreme heat, in order to survive, it doesn't usually take very long to figure out, you know, we got to move, right? We've got to go somewhere else. And so you see this happening today, right? I mean, this is a phenomenon that we're sort of witnessing happen, right? Climate migration, islands that are completely underwater, places in the United States that are underwater today, right? That are increasingly difficult to live in. And that will continue, right? If the science that we have all been hearing about uh, turns out to be true, if the predictions turn out to be true. So people, animals move to areas where there's better food, better water, stronger likelihood of surviving. But of course, one of the problems is that when you move to a new place looking for food, looking for water, looking for shelter, looking to survive, inevitably you're going to run into other people and run into other animals. And the newcomers are often going to be resented by the long term residents, shall we say, and those groups are going to compete uh, for resources, right? And they're going to compete for land. They're going to compete for whatever's growing on that land, the animals living on it, the fish living on it, the birds, the water, the territory. And some will survive and some will not. Um, and you guys have heard this term, right? Survival of the fittest, right? From, you know, evolutionary biology, Charles Darwin. Uh, And that's what happens, right? So do we have woolly mammoth in North America anymore? No. Do we have wild horses that, were here from thousands of years ago? No. Do we have lions? No. The bison survived, but was one of the few survivors. And this is going to cause a huge shift in the way that indigenous peoples live, because the ones that are able to survive this period of climate change and come out on the other side of it are going to have to adapt to a new way of living. Now, when this period of climate change ended and the mass extinctions that I just talked about of mainly um, four-legged animals, but also large numbers of people didn't survive either. Um, Indigenous peoples who experienced this dramatic shift in climate and in the way that it affected environments in North America had to make a choice, right? They had to decide whether it was going to make sense to continue living the way they had always lived in the past, or whether they would take a chance um, and try to live in a way where they were not so reliant on hunting, right? Because again, it's mainly these large animals that go extinct. And if that's your number one food source, you might go extinct too. So the people who survive this sort of dramatic moment in time have to decide, right? Are we going to just continue doing what we always did before and roll the dice and see what happens? Or are we going to try something different and see what happens um, if we live in a way that takes advantage of other resources, so that if this ever happens again, right, we'll be prepared. So what you see is that many more indigenous peoples after this period of climate change, they start living in a more nomadic manner, meaning they start moving around to different environments at different times of the year, right? Mainly based on the seasons of the year. And the reason they make these migrations is because at different times of the year, different environments have different resources to offer, right? So, for example, this is if we think about the four seasons here in the Northeast, right? Um, in the spring, that is typically the time that people would plant their crops. So you would want to be near your farmland to put seeds in the ground and fertilizer and to tend the crops. But the springtime is also the time that fish return from the ocean, swim upstream into the rivers of the Northeast, and spawn and lay eggs. And so springtime is usually a very good time to fish. So indigenous people will both make sure they're near their farmland, but also make sure they move near the best fishing spots near the rivers and lakes that are connected to the Atlantic. In the summer, while the crops are growing, obviously, uh, people in the group will need to take care of those crops, but at the same time, fishing will continue, and that again will require constant movement among the different people who are involved in that activity. In the fall, crops have to be harvested and stored for use over the winter, but that's also when hunting begins. Um, and hunting will continue through the winter. And even fishing, right? If fishing could be done along the coast or even ice fishing, um, those activities would also be done, but would also require movement to have access to the best hunting grounds and fishing spots. And then those cycles would repeat again come spring. So again, all of this being done as a hedge against future disaster, right? So that you make sure that you're not relying on just one um, part of nature to survive, but you're relying on as many resources as possible. So, fish, meat, vegetables, nuts, berries, uh, birds, etc. Right? So it's I think a smarter way to live and definitely has more health benefits than just eating meat um, constantly. And for you meat eaters listening to this, I'm sorry. Now, within indigenous communities, the work that I just talked about, which was very difficult work, was divided up based on gender. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. Now, when we think about the types of powers that men and women had, I need a drink, just a second. When we think about the types of powers that men and women had in indigenous communities, we can think about that in a couple different ways. One is power within the family. Um, Men and women had the power to obviously get married, have family, uh, do all this work to try to keep themselves healthy and alive, but also did have the power to divorce if they felt that the marriage was not working out, they felt uh, if if they felt they could no longer live together, if one or both spouses in the marriage uh, had done something, really shocking and offensive to the other that violated the marital bond, uh, divorce was an option, right? So within the family, you know, there certainly um, was, I guess, some measure of equality in terms of husbands and wives, right? That they could always find their way out if they needed to, if the marriage turned sour. Now, in terms of politics within these communities, and again, not every indigenous community functioned like this, but many of them did. Um, the political leaders, the rulers of indigenous groups, nations, communities, whatever term you want to use, um, these leaders were always men, right? But women played a very powerful and interesting role in choosing who the actual leaders would be. It was often councils of indigenous women who decided which men would lead the group or represent the interests of the group. And if those men uh, who were put in those positions of authority violated uh, their uh, commitment to the group, stopped working for the group, and used their position to enrich themselves, the women could actually take them out of office, right? So even though women are not playing a direct political role in making, large decisions for the entire group, they do play an important sort of behind the scenes role in determining who will be in office and who will stay in office, even though they themselves cannot occupy uh, these political positions. Now, in terms of their responsibilities, right? So we looked a little bit at their powers, right? So men and women each have different types of power specific to their gender. Responsibilities look mainly at work here. And I just want to start off by making a very simple point that I want you to remember. Women did most of the hard work um, in these communities. Uh, in addition to the political decision making that women engaged in, which I just described, women did all the farm work, right? They did all of that farm work. Of course, and anyone listening to this who is a mother or has small children living with you, um, holding a kid in you for 9 months is work. I've never had to do it, but I can only imagine. My sisters have, my mother did. Um, Having to take care of that child by yourself because your husband's not going to help. Women were fully responsible for taking care of the children, feeding them, cleaning them, clothing them, raising them. Uh, they have to do all the domestic work, so cooking, cleaning, the child care, as I mentioned. Uh, and they help out with a lot of other activities, gathering nuts and berries, root vegetables, firewood, construction materials. And every time the group moves, right, based on the season, they move the campsite. And it's the women who pack up all of the belongings, pack up all of um, the dwellings, everything that they possess, and drag that stuff themselves from one place to another with no pack animals, no horses or mules or anything like that. So women have the hardest jobs, which is probably still true today, right? Um, the hardest jobs within the family, but also some of the hardest jobs in terms of subsistence, keeping the family healthy and keeping them alive. What jobs did the men do? You know, and I don't want to put down men. Obviously, the men are working. Um, they did a lot of hunting, right? Um, which again could be dangerous. You know, if you're out there hunting a grizzly bear and the grizzly bear decides to try to eat you, right? You might die. Um, so hunting, we can say men did the hunting, women didn't hunt. But not an easy job. Let's not, you know, diminish the dangers associated with that. They did a lot of fishing. Um, and again, potential dangers associated with fishing. You could fall in the water. People didn't know how to swim. You could drown in a few inches of water, and people did. Um, so they hunted and they fished and they participated in politics, right? And the men were always the ones who participated in military campaigns and wars, right? So, which didn't happen all the time, but when they did happen, they had to be prepared and they had to be ready to fight. And so, again, jobs, powers, responsibilities divided up based on whether one was a man or a woman. Now, I'll just add one final point here, which is interesting to mention. There were indigenous peoples who had transgender members. Now, um, not every indigenous group had this, but there were some that I've read about, primarily in what is now California, uh, where there were men who actually dressed as women and who basically spent their lives performing the jobs and tasks that were associated with women. And not a lot is known about this custom and tradition and why this happened and why it took place. But it's a part of Indigenous history that I think is worth knowing. That we often think about the world in terms of men and women, but there are people who sort of occupy both roles sometimes, and they're equally part of um, the history, and they're what make, I think, the history worth studying, right? Because people don't always fit into these sort of neat and tidy boxes that we've created for them. Now, if we look at the next slide, which we're going to do in a minute if I don't talk too long, um, you're going to see again another map that will have lots of different indigenous groups' names on it. And this one is circa 1600. It's mainly going to be in what is now the US, part of Mexico too. Um, and the purpose of including this is just again to remind you of the diversity of indigenous peoples in North America, that they're not all one group that all thought the same and did the same things. but also to show you that these different groups often lived very close to one another and that they interacted. They didn't live in isolation from each other. Um, they interacted sometimes even if they didn't speak the same language. They found ways to interact. Um, and I'll just talk about a few of those here for a minute, right? Some of this will sound familiar because people still do these things today, right? People from different groups, had relationships, had friendships, had sex, had children, got married, had families. Um, People from different groups exchanged ideas, had conversations, um, exchanged goods and services that the others required. Um, Sometimes they signed treaties with each other to agree to cooperate in times of distress. Um, Sometimes they went to war with each other. Sometimes they didn't get along. So intergroup relations could be positive, but they could be negative, right? I mean, um, they could share religious ideas. They could go to war over religious ideas. They could share resources. They could go to war over the same set of resources, right? So the point is that indigenous peoples, I think, in many ways, thought and behaved and lived in much the same way that most human beings have thought and lived and behaved, right? They're human, just like all of us. And uh, the ways that they sort of conducted themselves in their daily lives um, were not much different. But what's interesting to just consider here is that in general, they accepted diversity, right? They accepted that they lived in a world where there were people not like them. Um, they didn't have fences or borders or walls around their property, and they uh, found ways to cooperate with people who were not like them. And also, as I said, sometimes had difficulties with people who were not like them. Now, I want to double back to a point that I neglected on this slide that I want you guys to, you're taking notes, I know that, so make sure that this is something that you get down in your notes. It's the point about land ownership, and you see it right in the center of the slide. Indigenous peoples did not believe that land could be owned, right? So I just want to underline that point. Indigenous people did not believe that land could be owned. Indigenous peoples had a very sort of humble view of their place in the world, that the world was here before they were born and that it would be here after they died. And that indigenous peoples, uh, therefore, could do really only two things with land. They could claim it as a home, right? People have to live somewhere. So they could claim a piece of land as their home, and they could claim that piece of land based on their group's history, right? They could say, well, our group's been here for 50,000 years, so this is our home and we live here. Um, or they could claim it based on having fought a war with another group and having won a piece of land as a result of a war, right? So again, they're claiming land as a home and a place to grow crops and survive. They're not saying they own it, they claim it without ownership. So that's the first. So they said there's two ways that indigenous peoples related to land. One is by claiming it as a home. The other is by using its resources, right? So they claimed a right to use the resources on lands that they claimed, right? So whatever animals lived there, fish, trees, water, grasses, nuts, berries, etc., whatever was there, they could use, right? But again, not own, because again, they have this humble view of themselves with relation to the earth that they inhabit and they understand that they're sort of small fish in a big ocean, and that ownership of land is not something that um, is really allowed. That we're here for a short time. The earth itself has been here and will be here for a long time. And so owning a piece of land would be ludicrous, right? It would be ridiculous to own something like a piece of land. Um, and as such, they didn't build fences, as I mentioned before, or walls or borders around their property. Um, Visitors were allowed to come in. Um, if visitors from another group needed resources, needed food, needed water, needed some plants to survive, the host would often allow um, the visitors to have whatever they needed, with the understanding that if they needed help in the future, that there would be mutual exchange. So that's a really important point, because Indigenous people's view of land ownership, which is that it's not allowed, it can't be done, is in stark contrast to that of Europeans. And that will be one of the points where Indigenous people and uh, Europeans clash, is over this idea of land ownership. All right, sorry I missed that point. So if we look around the year 1000, what we start to see in North America is that more and more Indigenous people start to settle down in one location, right? So I just described a culture where people generally were constantly on the move 4 seasons of the year, which means they're sort of constantly moving to take advantage of different resources at different times of the year. But over time, what we start to see is that populations of these different groups go up. And as a result, the leaders of these groups have more to worry about, right? Uh, the population goes up, more mouths need to be fed, more territory needs to be defended, potentially against people who want to steal resources, or uh, steal people, or even steal land. So you start to see more of these groups settle down in one location and start to occupy one location, um, instead of this constant movement 3 or 4 times of the year. Now, again, population increase, you might ask yourself, okay, well, why is there population increase um, at that time around the year 1000? Well, the primary reasons I'm going to look at have to do with diet, right? That diversified subsistence that we just talked about, right? Where they're eating not just meat, but eating vegetables, eating fruits, um, fish, and a variety of other wildly occurring natural resources, helps people live longer, right? If you're on just a meat diet, good luck. But if you're supplementing the meat with a variety of other foods, your health will improve. And if those habits are passed on generation by generation, you will start to see people survive longer, people live longer. And as people live longer, they have more children, right? So diet plays a really important role here. Also, the introduction of 3 new crops into North America around the year 1000. And eventually, these crops would overspread the entire continent. Indigenous people often refer to these as the three sisters. And you see these three in this photo here: corn, beans, and squash, right? Three of my favorites, really good sources of fiber. Historians, food historians, and also archaeologists have been able to trace the impacts of the Three Sisters on Indigenous peoples' population, and show that with the introduction of these crops, which originated in Mexico, the introduction of these crops into what is now the US, population growth accelerates among indigenous people. So the leaders of these groups have healthier populations, they have larger populations that they're responsible for taking care of. And because they have healthier and larger populations, um, they're very likely occupying larger pieces of land. And most of what they need, they can probably get right where they're living, right? Corn, beans, and squash can really grow anywhere. It's not something you have to go out and look for. And as more indigenous people were growing these crops, in addition to others, and continuing their hunting and fishing, you start to see more permanent settlements and less of that migration than you saw in the past. And in a second, we'll look at an example of that. Well, it might be more than a second, but bear with me. And again, I told you a minute or 10 ago that I would be including this map, selected North American cultural group circa 1600, to show you again the diversity of the groups living in North America at the time, right? This is right as right on the eve of English colonization, but well after the French and Spanish had arrived. But also to show you how close these groups live to each other, to again reinforce the point that in order to survive, these groups often had to find ways to cooperate and coexist, which did not mean they always got along, right? And that's an important point that I want you to remember. Now, the last point that we're going to talk about in this lesson is an example to illustrate the point that I just mentioned about permanent settlements. This is probably one of the most famous permanent settlements of indigenous people that ever was built in North America. It's a place you can go and visit today, right? So this is a place called Cahokia. Around the year 1100, Cahokia had somewhere between 15,000 and 45,000 people living inside, right? It's a community. It occupied a 5 square mile tract of land along the Mississippi River, not far from where St. Louis, Missouri is today. It's sort of almost in the middle of the U.S. And at the time, um, it was the largest city in North America, right? Maybe a place you never heard of. But it was, uh, for its time, a very large city. Now, 5 square miles, 15,000 people, you know, that could be a neighborhood in New York City, right? A small neighborhood. Um, 15,000 used to be the number of students at Queensborough when I was hired. So, again, when we think about this was the biggest city in North America at the time, place that in context, right? Today, this is a place that most people wouldn't know about. But 900 years ago, this was a place that was a large, for the time, urban center. Now, how was Cahokia governed? Because it's a permanent settlement, right? It's not one of these groups that's sort of making these seasonal migrations every 3 months. This is a place where people live more or less all year. So there are both potential problems with that and potential opportunities, right? Cahokia was governed by what is effectively a monarchy, right? A system of hereditary, unelected rule. Hereditary meaning a position that's passed down within the dominant ruling family. Um, Unelected, of course, meaning that uh, the person occupying the position of king or emperor, the monarch, um, is not elected. The voters, there are no voters, have no say in who this person is. how they get into office, how long they stay there. And there's no way to really get them out of office other than waiting for them to die, right? So politics in Cahokia was conducted along these lines, a monarchy, right? So not every indigenous group in North America operated this way. There were some that operated like this, others that were less centralized and less authoritarian. But Cahokia is a monarchy. So again, there was a ruling family, and uh, if you think about monarchies today, I mean, the historical origins of monarchies are almost always rooted in some kind of war or conflict where the winning family uh, controlled most of the land and could claim to control the country, right? In this case, 5 square miles. Um, so this ruling family had uh, a pretty sizable palace, I guess you might say. If you see that little image there in the slide, in that the area right in the center, there's that like greenish looking uh, structure. That's where the rulers of Cahokia would live. So, right, again, a reminder to the people there who would pass by and see this structure every day that somebody important lives in here, right? You might never see the monarch themselves, but you see uh, you see the building and you sort of automatically associate that with somebody who has that authority and power. It's just like if you visit the White House, right? You may never see the president, him or herself, um, but you don't have to because the house itself sort of represents the person. Buckingham Palace in London, or even the Royal Palace in Bangkok. I mean, the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. I mean, all these buildings, you can find them throughout the world that project authority, that project power. So you really never have to see the person, but the built environment sends a message, right? The monarch in Cahokia didn't live in a studio apartment, and there are reasons for that. So the monarch occupies this sort of elaborate structure. Is sort of, you can see they're built a wall around the area where uh, he lives, because it's always a man. And you might ask yourself, well, okay, he lives in this large structure. Um, yes, it's used to project authority and dominance and power, but what other functions could it play? Well, he's got a big family, so the family has to have a place to live. Um, Also, if the people ever turn against him, he doesn't want it to be easy for them to find him, right? So he's got to have a big house, because if the people ever decide they want to get rid of him, um, they can see where he lives. So if the interior of the structure is confusing and difficult to navigate, he might be able to survive, right? Um, and if there's a wall around the building, then you have another layer of protection from a potentially unruly or dissatisfied public. Um, so again, the built environment, and I'm an environmental historian, so I pay close attention to these details when I'm teaching, and also when I'm doing research and writing. The built environment sends an important message, right? There are no accidents in the way that these environments are constructed. You might ask yourself, looking at that little picture, well, whose homes are inside the wall? For lack of a better term, those are probably the ass kissers, right? Those are probably the people who have kissed enough butt with the ruling family that they've managed to get a place inside the wall, right, where they're presumably more protected. Um, they probably have some, you know, job that they do for the ruling family, for the government. Probably some, bureaucratic job that keeps them busy and keeps them occupied. And in exchange for kissing butt, they get to keep their home inside the palace gates, as it were. And then, of course, as you can see, if you look at the outside of that wall, you see lots and lots of little homes, right? So you see that the vast majority of the population is outside the protection of that wall, right? And so if you want to think about layers of protection that monarchies create for themselves, if an invading force shows up, if an army shows up to attack, it's all those people, presumably the common people or the ordinary people, whatever terminology you want to use, presumably it's those people who are going to get killed first, right? They're going to be asked to defend the city wall, and if the invaders are much stronger, they'll probably be annihilated first. But it, the way this is set up gives you some insight into the thinking of the monarch. The common people, the ordinary people, they don't count, right? Their lives don't matter. They can be replaced. They're healthy. They have a good diet. They'll reproduce. They won't all die. And the ones who survive will reproduce and life will go on, whether there's an invasion or not. So you see the sort of total lack of regard that these unelected hereditary rulers have for their people, right? Their people are taught to respect them and fear them, right? But really, is there any reciprocity there? Is there any give and take, right? The people are taught to respect the ruler, to acknowledge their power and authority, but what's the ruler giving them in return, right? I mean, it's often a very unequal relationship. And it's even more unequal when you think about the powers that these monarchs have, right? They can determine what type of job you do, they can determine where you live, they can determine whether you're going to be forced to provide military service. They could even determine who you're going to marry. Um, so, your life as a person in this type of an environment is pretty restricted, right? If you're not born into that family, um, that ruling family, you might be born into a family of people who kissed butt, and then you might get some little low level government job that will protect you. But in exchange, of course, you have to give up your integrity to kiss the butt of an unelected hereditary ruler. But for the vast majority of people, and this is, I think, still true today, you're born into a world where people are making decisions about your life and not asking you first, right? Not considering your concerns, not considering your fears, your hopes, your dreams, your questions. They're just making decisions and then expecting you to follow orders, right? And so I think when we think about the way Cahokia is set up, yes, it's a monarchy. Um, we don't have a monarchy in America today. There are very few monarchies left in the world, in fact. But if you think about it, that's really how government works even now, right? Most of the population is invisible. The rulers live in large houses surrounded by fences. And there's this constant fear and anxiety about what the people might do if they ever decide they're tired of the system that they live under. So it's worth, this digression, I think, is worth making to consider the ways that people, indigenous people, organize their societies. They're not that different from the way that people live today. The environment that they lived in, and I'll show you an image at the end of the slide that we'll talk about in a minute. They had these large mounds, which you can still see today, which were generally used for burying the dead, right? I'll show you a photo of one of those in a minute. People lived in these small villages, and you can see them scattered around the main compound there in Cahokia. And again, just like the society we live in, the society was organized around rank and social class, right? So if you're lucky to be born into that ruling family and your dad is the monarch and you're just waiting for him to die so you can take the throne, you're at the top, right? If you're willing to kiss some butt to get a government job or some kind of meaningless title, you're probably going to be somewhere in the middle, never right at the top, but also not at the bottom. But if you're born into one of these villages of farmers or fishermen, hunters, gatherers who live sort of on the periphery of the compound, good luck, right? I mean, good luck if anybody in government ever asks you what your opinions are, or what you think, or what you want. Um, and good luck surviving under such conditions. And survival became really important around 1500, right? 1500, we're roughly halfway through a period in environmental history called the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age went on for roughly 550 years, right? Started roughly in 1300 and ended around 1850. And again, um, those are rough estimates. I don't want you to think to yourself, well, on January 1st, 1300, everything froze over, right? And it was frozen for 550 years. And that's not how this worked. It's a period of climate and environmental history. So, a period of generally cooler global temperatures, generally harsher winters, generally um, longer winters as well. Um, and precipitation changes, like I talked about before. So, some years drought, some years heavy snowfall. That happened globally. And there's actually some nice histories of the Little Ice Age. If you're ever interested, email me. I can recommend a couple books about it. I mean, the Little Ice Age created enormous political and economic change in the world um, throughout the time that it went on. I mean, it contributed to the growth of the Russian state in Siberia. It was a contributing factor to the Black Death. Uh, and it led to the decline and collapse of civilizations, and Cahokia is one of them, right? So during the Little Ice Age, Cahokia's population grew, right? Started to grow. Now, again, if you think about where Cahokia is, it's in the middle of the US, it's close to the Mississippi River. It's in an area that typically doesn't get really bad winters anyway. They have winter in Missouri, but in eastern Illinois or western Illinois, but typically not like your typical northeastern winter. So the effects of the Little Ice Age in Cahokia were not um, as pronounced as they were in maybe more northern climates, um, but they certainly did have their impact. As the population grew, though, in Cahokia, the amount of food and water available for the people living there started to drop. And that's something that's historically, always a relationship that you can sort of see coming, right? As there's more people living in a confined area, there's going to be a competition, a scramble for resources, and a competition to survive, right? I mean, that's just like what we talked about with the climate change from 10,000 years ago. So the people living in Cahokia begin to struggle. The Little Ice Age, the impacts of the Little Ice Age have made farming, hunting, and gathering more difficult, plus the population increase. So combined, there's fewer resources for more people. And what ends up happening is the population of Cahokia leaves, right? And they don't all leave at once on the same day, but there's this sort of slow period of evacuation where people um, from Cahokia simply leave that area and go to places where uh, there are more resources and fewer people, and better opportunities to survive. And there's no evidence of what I'm going to say, at least as far as I know, and I've read quite a bit of Indigenous history. There's no evidence of this, but I'm just going to go out on a limb and make a claim here. Um, it would seem to me that Indigenous people who evacuated Cahokia during this period of crisis when there was not enough food and not enough water for this growing population, that some of them had to have been thinking, you know what, this government sucks, right? They haven't done anything for us. Why should we stay here, right? Why should we continue living here? They're not protecting us. They're not representative, and they got the hell out of there, right? So again, there's no evidence, there's no documentary record to show us that, but that idea had to have gone through the mind of at least one person who left Cahokia. Now, Europeans arrived in this part of the Mississippi River Valley in the 16th century. French and Spanish explorers traveled through this part of the Midwest. And I'm going to go to the last slide to talk about their interpretation. This is what Cahokia looks like today. It's actually a state historic site that you can visit. There's a very nice museum there. There's really nice bike trails and hiking trails that you can check out, and it's actually very well maintained. If you're ever in that part of the country, if you ever go to St. Louis, you know it's a nice day trip, half day trip that you can take. But when European explorers got to Cahokia in the uh, early to mid 16th century, the city of Cahokia was gone, right? The population had left. The buildings that were left behind, the structures that they had built, the farmland had deteriorated and rotted and fallen into disrepair. Since most of it was made out of wood and tree branches and other sort of plant life, it disintegrated pretty fast. And what was left were those mounds that I talked about. And you can see those mounds have survived to this day. And Europeans, when they found these mounds, wrote about them, right? Actually, wrote in correspondence that they sent back to their homes and wrote about these mounds, but really didn't say much about them. They more so commented on how beautiful the area was, how it was right next to the river, how it was so green and lush, and there was so much plant life available. And their interpretation of what they found at Cahokia was the following. Many of them said, you know what? God must have known we were coming, because if he didn't know we were coming, this environment would not look like this. It wouldn't be so lush and beautiful and ready to be farmed, right? Because they could actually see the remnants of what had been a community. And some of the Europeans who observed the remains of Cahokia even said, well, you know what? God must have cleared away whoever was living here beforehand, knowing that we were coming, so we would have a place to live. Right? So hang on to that idea, because that we're going to definitely come back to that um, as we continue our lesson. So thank you for listening. I hope you guys are all having a good uh, first week in the class. If you have any questions, please email me. As I mentioned in my welcome video, um, you're, if you want to have a group review or a group discussion of anything in the class, all you have to do is ask. I'm open to suggestions. I'm open to your ideas, and I want you to succeed. So please make sure you've taken good notes, and please be ready for your quiz. Thanks.